Welcome to the AIER's Authors Corners podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Yang, and today we have a very special guest, as always. His name is Richard Epstein. He's a professor of law at NYU, a senior lecturer at the University of Chicago, as well as a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Without exaggeration, Richard's one of the foremost legal experts, not only on this side of the philosophical aisle, but in general. Today, we'll be talking about one of his great books, Simple Rules for a Complex World, which is a book that has a simple title, but a very profound message. Richard, it's great to have you.
It's very nice. I'm simply delighted to be here.
So your book talks about the intersection of law and economics, which is a very popular and up and coming field. But I guess to the general public, they might be confused of why a lawyer must know economics or an economist must know law. So why did you feel the need to touch on this subject, and why should we be concerned about this topic in general?
Well, the first thing to note is that there was a very long period of time in the study of legal rules and legal relationships where any explicit reference to economic concepts was regarded as either incomprehensible on the one hand or as inappropriate on the other. And although you haven't mentioned it, the first course that I ever took in law school was a subject in Roman law, and it's a course that I still teach to this very day. And Roman law was enigmatic or emblematic of the way in which this operated. And so you could read all sorts of incredibly accurate descriptions of the way the law was then, most of which remain common today. And then when you looked around, you try to figure out, well, what was the explanation for it? And they said, well, this is simply in the nature of things. De rerum naturae, or some such thing like that. My Latin is terrible. And so people would start looking at that and say, well, what does nature tell us? I got on the telephone and she didn't pick up. Is nature God? Is God nature? So it turned out that what happened is you had a set of rules, and then you looked at them and you had two things about it. One, the justifications for them were quite weak in terms of the way in which they were done, but the durability of the rules and the universality of the rules was extremely great. So if you wanted to figure out in 4 words how you would describe a sound legal regime, only 4: contract, yes; aggression, no, would be the way in which you would start to go. Well, then the question is like, why? And so what the economics does is it allows you to put a fairly powerful substructure underneath what has been a very durable set of legal rules and practices. So the way in which we do is just take these first 2 rules that I've mentioned and see how you part them out. Contract, yes. Well, as a first approximation, and law is always a business of successive approximation, what are the things that we like about contracts? Well, it turns out that you get 2 people, and if you're doing this right, big caveat, what you discover is each person has to surrender something to the other in order to get something in exchange. Okay, well, why are you going to do this? If a contract is a sterile transaction in which you just change the title of things around so you have a horse and a cow before the transaction and a horse and a cow after the transaction, or a horse and $100 before and after, what's the point? Well, what happens is you don't think of these things strictly as a matter of things or of wealth. What you do is you think of them as giving utility to their owners. And so therefore, when you have this exchange of thing for thing or thing for money, what you're confident about in the ordinary case is 2 things. One is that the buyer values more what he or she receives, and the seller values more the cash to the thing that he or she surrendered. So all of a sudden, a transaction which looks sterile, if you just look at particular things, now all of a sudden becomes what we call a positive sum game. Well, the moment you use those terms, you're taking Roman law and updating it to 1944 with Van Neumann and Morgenstern, simple game theory. Well, why do you use the game theory? Because all of a sudden it gives you an explanation as to why it's contract, yes. But as I said, all of these things turn out to be presumptions. So what are the reasons why you might want to set the presumptions aside? Well, you started with the basic theory, which said, we like these things because they're essentially mutual gain transactions. And then what you have to do is to figure out, is there any way that you could upset that judgment? And it turns out, if you're doing this thing correctly, as law and economics would instruct you to do, there are always 2 ways to evaluate a transaction. One is to evaluate it in terms of the effects upon the 2 parties. And then the third thing is to enter into what we call externalities today, the effects upon third party. And then the question is, can you override these presumptions? Well, if you start looking at the transaction between the parties, if somebody misrepresents the relative value of two goods, then it turns out that somebody may either buy or sell and be left worse off in virtue of the fraud. So in order to protect the ideal of a gainful exchange, you have to be able to examine the conditions which may undermine it in terms of the inducement. Well, is that costless? The answer is no. And so if you allow these things to be set aside too easily, and then people could fraudulently claim that they were in fact improperly treated, and so the mechanism of contract would be shut down. So all of a sudden you're now doing economics of another sort. What you do is you have a valid idea of uncertain impact, and then the question is how you design institutions to figure out how you separate the good claims from the bad claims. And by law, at this particular time, you worry about pleading, you worried about who has the burden of proof, you worry about the sequence of presentations, you worry about who's going to verify it. And all of this is designed to make sure that the exchanges work between the parties. And this is a pretty big branch of law. And so the irony is that if you're actually living in life, the contract, yes, probably dominates 99.9% of the transactions, but lawyers spend their time worrying about that other 0.1%, because if you don't get that right, the whole system may start to unravel. So that's the contract side. And you can see how it slowly expands. And in each case, what we're trying to do is to figure out how it is that we can understand the mechanism so as to preserve, to the extent possible, the mutual gain transactions while shutting down those transactions which turn out to some extent to be skewed. It's a big business, but an important one. Then you look at the other side, aggression, no. Well, does it mean every time you use force that it turns out that you're going to be somehow to be held responsible? Well, the answer to that's no, but figure out what the basic intuition is. You have something that I want, and there are two ways I can get it. One is to buy it, and the other is to take it. And to buy it will cost me $100, but if I'm really skillful, it costs me only $20 to beat you up and to get the thing from you. What happens is, if you allow that kind of contract to take place, then in effect, the voluntary markets are going to be destroyed. And what you will see is that there'll be lots of cases where I'll take something for 20 that's worth 30 to me, what was worth 50 to you. So we not only have the casualties associated with the transaction, right, but we also have goods going from their higher to lower value uses. And the good utilitarian, the economics guy, doesn't like that. But does this mean that the presumption is going to be absolute? And the answer to that question is, of course not. Well, it turns out sometimes you use force in self-defense, but then you have exactly the same kind of inquiry you had before. Was this a real case of self-defense? Was it disproportionate force? Was it excessive force? Was there a good faith error or a bad faith error? So again, what you have to do is you look at this thing about aggression. Starts off very simple, and slowly you build in rules, because the rules are essentially designed to say that in those cases where the force that's used is designed to preserve the integrity of the property rights system, then you don't want to shut it down. But most cases, fortunately, don't fall within that. The typical case that you have a street arrest because of a robbery or a murder or a rape is not a case where these issues are going to arise. But there are enough cases where it does arise that you have to be able to figure it out. So that's the way you look at these two things, is between the parties. But there are other people in the world this large. And so there's a large category out there known as externalities. And this sounds very ominous, and they're of two sorts. They're negative and they're positive. Generally speaking, a legal system does relatively little to enforce positive externalities and a fair bit to try to shut down some of the negative externalities. But again, it's important to figure out how this works. So go back to contract. I've got a mutual exchange with you. And then what happens is, it turns out, Ethan, that the transaction that we're going to enter into is a transaction to rob a third person. And I know you're a nice guy. I'm a thoroughly decent guy, but the third person doesn't like this. So what we do is we get gains from the conspiracy, right? Which means that we're more effective at robbing than either of us would be if we acted alone. But the gains that we get come at the expense of a third person. And we know that aggression is a no-no. And so all of a sudden what we do is we have to punish certain kinds of contracts, and we call them conspiracies. And we punish them. And then the question is, how do you get the optimal level of sanction? Or it may be, Eugene, or Ethan, you and I are a little bit more, shall we say, polite. And all we do is decide to fix prices, and we dominate the market in a certain area. And now you have what the law calls a contract in restraint of trade, i.e. an antitrust monopoly, cartelization type violation. Well, why is it that we do these things? Because we're pretty confident, knowing economic theory, which is what you asked me about, right? That the gains to us from this particular combination are smaller than the gains to the rest of the world, who have managed to lose out by this situation. Well, how far are we going to push this? Well, it's real hard to know whether you and I have any real market power, because we don't want to prevent any partnership from being formed on the grounds that you and I can no longer be competitors, because then you'd only have sole proprietorship and the world wouldn't run that way. So all of a sudden you're doing exactly the same thing. Now, why is it that we generally don't worry about this? Because in most cases, when you and I enter into a contract, say for employment or the sale of goods, the externalities are going to turn positive. So you get a little bit more money, I get a better good, you're richer than you were before, I'm richer than I'm before. So each of us now have possibilities that are greater than before to trade with third persons. Now, it may be that individual people may be disappointed. The person you wanted to sell to, rather who wanted to buy from you, didn't get it because you sold to me and so forth. So we have to understand that competitive externalities are what they used to call in Roman law, damnum, absque and iurium. I don't think you know what that means. What it means is harm without legal injury. You have to say that competitive losses can never be something that's actionable. Otherwise, nobody can enter into a gainful transaction with anybody else unless they have the approval of the rest of the world. And so what we do is we allow those competitive losses to take place. But if the two of us decide to form a cartel and we have market power, all of a sudden it turns out. So you have to figure out which cooperative arrangements have negative externality, whether they're large enough to justify the interventions and so forth. And this particular area of law doesn't begin in primitive societies. The Romans didn't have much of it, but starting in around 1700 or so, all of a sudden Anglo-American law began to worry about these contracts and restraint of trade. And this gives rise to an immense field, regulated industries and antitrust, but it's all in service of the same point. We have our four little words right there: contract, yes; aggression, no. And then it turns out there are exceptions to both of these particular rules. And by the time you flesh together the basic intuition with the rest of the situation, it's kind of complicated as the way it works. But the key thing is that the first rules are sufficiently simple and they govern enough transaction that ordinary people for most of their lives will do very well indeed if they keep their hands to themselves and decide to pay rather than to take something when they go to a fruit stand. And it's that kind of instinct, that is the awareness that the complication can be kept within limited bounds and that the basic rules can be clear enough, is what drove me to write the book called Simple Rules for a Complex World.
And that brings us to the next question, which is basically your title, which is this profound realization, this profound rule about having simple rules, even though society itself is getting more complicated. And one of your biggest assertions is that the more complicated the system, the more simple the rules need to be. So in today's society, so cosmopolitan, so diverse, so complicated, what do we say to the people in the Biden administration who would like to regulate everything, make all sorts of regulations to make our lives better, to keep us safe? Why would they be better off be adopting simple rules?
Well, because what happens is the larger the complicated rules are, you then introduce a third complication, namely that the governors have to be able to determine the interest for people better than these people are able to determine themselves. And they have to have a motive which is as pure as the driven snow, so that they will not try to create the very kinds of monopolies and cartels that the legal system is designed to avoid. Now, let me just put it in terms of the private side as well to figure out. There are two kinds of corporations, roughly speaking, in the world. There are private corporations, which are family members, relatively small, and there are very large corporations which have 1,000 upon thousands of shareholders and so forth. What you do is, in the simple rules, complex world situation, this is the prediction you make, and it turns out to be accurate. If you enter into, Ethan, a family business, right, with your brother-in-law and your sister and your second uncle and so forth, it's a very complicated business, and there's a very heavy overlap between what you do in the business and what you do socially. It's also the case that all of you have kind of unique roles in this situation. Someone's an expert in finance, one in marketing. It's also the case that somebody's old and going out of the business, somebody's young and coming up to the business. And so what you do is you have very complicated rules amongst people with a high degree of trust, indicating who can do what, to whom and when, how you divide the take and so forth. Now, are you going to allow any of those individuals to have free alienation of their shares? And the answer is never, because it turns out you've got 6 people and one of them could sell to a total stranger. And these are very close trust relationships. The 6th person coming in and the 1st person going out, it's going to make the thing completely unstable. So those businesses are organized to make sure that nobody could alienate their shares separately, but everybody collectively can sell the entire business to a third party. And then they take the money and divide it as it sees fit. So there you have a very small situation, a lot of personal information, complicated rules. But now suppose you've got a corporation which has 1 million people. Well, there's no way that these folks can get together and start to work things out. There's no way that you can say, okay, Ethan, you've got your shares and you're 27 or 23, you do this, I'm 70, whatever it is, I do this, and everybody else wants to cut their own deal. So you go exactly the opposite way. There is no business. Everybody can sell their shares freely. All the shares now have to be the same. So the capital structure of $1 billion corporation is simpler than the capital structure of $1 million corporation, because now we want people to be able to get in and out. And the only way they can get in and out is for the things to be fungible. Well, there's also another problem. How do you run this business? Well, in your family corporation, you could trust your uncle and your sister-in-law and so forth. In this large corporation, I'm not going to trust, nor are they going to trust me, any other anonymous shareholder to run this thing, particularly since they could buy and sell at any time. So you put together a permanent board of directors. And the key thing to understand is the reason I like this is now I don't have to figure out what my other shareholders think for the most part. I can be shareholders with anybody. What I have to do is to make sure that these boards do things right. And what we do is we develop a couple of very simple rules called fiduciary duties, one of loyalty and one of care, so that these characters basically get their compensation in the cash that we pay them, but they're not allowed to loot the corporation or to dissipate its asset. So the simple rules for a complex world say, here's a classic illustration where the businesses get more and more complicated, right? And the capital structures have to get simpler and simpler. Well, what else? Well, sometimes you have to borrow money, right? Well, if you're borrowing in a closed corporation, it's really funny because it turns out you could take the cash, borrow the money, and distribute it to shareholders, leaving the lender with an empty shell. So in private corporations, you always require personal guarantees. You always put limitations on dividends. If you're a corporation with $100 billion, however, you're not going to go around to 1 million shareholders and ask they each sign guarantees for this particular company. What you do is you find other ways to do it. You find it with insurance policies or sureties of one kind or another. And so once you understand how this large, small number situation works, you can basically figure out how you structure these arrangements. Now, what is it dependent upon? Interestingly enough, surprisingly little. You're going to have the same kind of corporate structure if you're baking bread or if you're baking chips of one kind or another, because the transaction cost dynamic are in the same cases. So you're always trying to do is to figure out how you avoid nasty incentives with cheap kinds of corrective devices, and it yields some very different solutions in these various situations. And if you understand what's going on and you apply the simple rules for a complex world mechanism, you don't say, oh my God, my corporation is 10 times as large as it used to be. I now need a more complicated capital structure. It tends to go exactly in the opposite direction. There's still problems about force, still problems about misrepresentation. Well, now probably centralized enforcement through an SEC may be better than private rights of action. Because as you mentioned about the Biden administration, it's true of any administration. The guys who run the enforcement mechanisms could have incentives of their own to get things wrong. The simpler the rules, the less discretion they have, the less danger of official advice. So on taxation, for example, I have always defended for general revenues flat taxes, because it turns out it's much less strategic behavior. And when you're dealing with a huge population, it's even broader and more complicated body than is the shareholders of a corporation. The simpler the tax rule, the more possible it is that you'll be able to raise the right levels of revenues without having all the political intrigue and abuse that takes place. So that's the motivation that takes place in these areas.
So if I was a government regulator, say at the EPA or the FTC, and I want to protect the environment or maybe police antitrust laws to make sure the market's free and open, my general instinct maybe to ban things, make all these laws. But in your book, you say that market mechanisms such as private property and contracts are probably the best way to make sure that we have a clean environment and a competitive marketplace free of monopolies. So can you explain?
Okay, well, look, there are two issues. We've already hinted about the monopoly issue. Contracts and restraint of trade, you have a choice. Do you try to leave them unenforceable, which is a cheap remedy? Or do you try to impose damage remedies, which are very expensive, harder to prove? And I think the question is, how fast will unenforced contracts disintegrate? And by and large, the consensus tends to be, when we're dealing with this antitrust stuff, you have to have some positive intervention. But antitrust has three parts to it. And part number one is horizontal arrangements. And there you could see real possibilities of gain when you get two competitors coming together. But a vertical arrangement where we're at different stages in the production chain and they get together, there are a lot of efficiencies there because what you do is you avoid holdout problems as you go from stage one to stage two. So generally the presumption should be in favor of the legitimacy of vertical arrangements rather than the real legitimacy. So that horizontal vertical arrangement is a kind of a simple rule to sort these things out. And then you mentioned, conglomerate mergers is the last kind. Well, these are not going to take place very often. And why is that? Because you just don't get any synergies of any sort. You don't get the antitrust type of synergies and you don't get any production synergies. So, there are lots of them that took place in the late 1960s based on management skills. And surely most of them ended up breaking up because there was nothing to keep these guys together. If you want to have a diversified portfolio as a shareholder, you don't buy a company that does 10 things badly. You buy shares in 10 different companies, each of which does one thing well. And so what you do is you find is a natural market pressure for you to sort of focus your kind of inquiry. Apple did not become rich by selling donuts, right? It became rich by selling computers and one variation after another. And what you do is you have product and brand extension as a very clever way to do things. So that essentially every time you introduce a new product, what you do is you think of it as a Venn diagram. You have the first circle and the second one isn't exactly on top of it. It moves over and so forth. By the time you're done, you cover a lot. And one of the things that you remember is that when you are in an innovative economy, if your old products are going to go down the tubes, you might as well be the person who sends it on its exit because at least you could get the benefit from the next generation of project. The last thing you want to do is to say, I had a great project in 2018 and end up with no share of the market in 2022. Now, the environment is a kind of a different problem, but it's a very important one. And this is a distinction that we have to worry about between a simple rule and a complex rule. The simple rule is measure the outputs. The complex rule is to try to figure out the inputs. And so what happens is to take a perfect situation, you have a plan. And what it does is it exhibits certain kinds of pollution. And you use all sorts of crazy techniques, both to produce the goods on the one hand and to control the production on the other. One of the things you could try to do to reduce the production at first is to ask whether these people are put into use something that you might want to call the best systematic response to the problem in question. And there are all sorts of acronyms in environmental law that I keep forgetting, which try to do that. But you don't know what the trade-offs are. So I could reduce pollution by 10 units if I spend 3 units, or I could reduce it by 100 units if I spend 12 units, or by 1,000 if I spend 1,000,000. Where on that continuum do you want to be? And if you start measuring inputs, it becomes extremely difficult. So the way in which you tend to do this is you measure outputs. I don't care how you produce. If the producer is above a certain level, we're going to enjoin you, stop you, till you get it below that level. If it's below that level, we're going to tax you at the level equal to the social harm that you caused. It's much easier to measure the outputs than it is to measure the inputs. And so therefore, when you're dealing with the private law of nuisance, that's the way in which you generally basically say that in order to figure out how to regulate the pollution that you're creating, is you have to know everything about the way this firm produces its own goods. You put the restraint on and let it adapt. When you get to environmental stuff, there's another economic notion that basically becomes involved here, and it's the notion of transactions cost. It costs a lot of money to essentially stop somebody from doing something that's wrong. Well, the question you then have to ask is that money better spent on the public or on the private side? And the following basic kind of pattern, simple pattern, tends to emerge. If there's a single individual that suffers a very pronounced harm from a single source, generally speaking, it's easier to allow the private parties, one to sue the other and get damages or an injunction. But then nuisances have a very strange characteristic. They're portable, meaning in effect that I can emit pollution from my factory and it turns out I can damage, thousands upon thousands of people. Are they all supposed to sue me individually? Or it could be even worse. You could be in Los Angeles and you have thousands of cars emitting very harmful pollution that hurts millions of people. Do we still want to have these private rights of action? And the answer is, as the cost of the action increases relative to the gain that you expect, aggregation of claims becomes simpler. So you sometimes think about class actions, or more often you think about direct regulation. And where does this first begin? The basic solution that's used today was first announced very clearly and very accurately in a case fittingly called Anonymous, which was decided in 1536, a public nuisance case. And this involved blocking traffic. And what they said was as follows. If you basically put an obstacle up on a road or in a river of some sort, and somebody hits it, they can sue for their special damages because it's one person with a big loss. Everybody else has been delayed and perhaps inconvenienced by this, but trying to have 1,000 suits against this company is not going to make sense. So what you do is you get an administrative situation. Back in 1536, it was called the court leet. Today it's called the EPA. And they're the ones who's in charge with the fines, and they're the ones in charge with the injunction, so that you have this mixed regime of special damages and private rights of action, the big losses and concentrated losses, and general enforcement with respect to small ones, always looking at output. Now, what's the great danger of the environmental movement? Oh, well, there are two. One is instead of measuring outputs, they start fooling around with these inputs. So a very common dangerous situation is you have a fairly bad plant that pollutes, say, 100 units, and you'd like to replace it with a new plant which would produce only 10 units. And the government agents come along and say, we don't allow new plants to come online at 10 units of harm. It has to be 5. So what they're telling you in effect is they want you to stick with the 100 instead of getting it down by 9 because you can't get it down to 95. If you had the correct measures of outputs and these levels are getting lower, so now damages and taxes are more reliable, you say, oh my God, I can reduce my taxes by 85% by getting this better technology, and it's going to go. And so you never want to basically have really high permitting costs because it prevents that kind of substitution. So in the pipeline situation, which is a big issue, newer pipelines are always safer than older pipelines. But if somebody's going to start to say, well, you know, you got a 1 in 10,000 chance of having a leak, we can't let you build this pipeline. When the existing pipeline has not 1 in 10,000, but 1 in 100 chances of leak, what you do is you're screwing everything up because you don't figure out what the right question is. How do we minimize the kinds of externalities that are involved rather than how we get you to come to some sort of imaginary performance standard, which doesn't work. And what is true with pipelines applies to water, and it applies to the air and everything else. And what do we learn? We learn that new technologies are always safer than old technologies. Political knowledge goes up and down, but technical skills tend to increase, and they've got independent validation, engineering norms, output measures, and so forth. You want to encourage the substitution. So one of the things that the Trump administration did, which I supported actually in writing, was to try to reduce some of the deep inspections under the statute called NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, in which before you could build anything, you have to deal with every imaginary contingency in the world, to a system which says, oh my God, you've got a dangerous facility out there, get rid of it, put in something new, and then monitor the way in which it's operated so that you make sure that this thing doesn't get out of control. And the Biden administration has been on the wrong side of those issues traditionally, along with the Obama administration. And so this thing really starts to make a difference. So what's the simple rule here? The first simple rule is you look at outputs, you don't look at inputs. Second simple rule is if they're diffuse harms, think of public relief. If they're concentrated harms, think of private relief. That makes environmental law a lot simpler than it would be if you said every time we come along, we have to have some government agency deciding how it is that you build your widgets.
And that brings us to our next question. Place a huge emphasis on reducing administrative costs and increasing the ease of transactions. So why is that so integral to simple rules for a complex world?
Okay, well, here I have to give a nod to my great late friend, Ronald Kos. I always like to say about Ronald, he was not very smart, he was just brilliant. What Ronald did is, I mean, you have to imagine this. He goes and he watches a bunch of American plants in the 1930s, and he comes up with the following very simple operation, which is he did not know how firms were being organized. And he was trying to figure out why this firm this way, that firm that way. Do you have a partnership? Do you have a corporation? Do you have an employer-employee arrangement? And what Ronald said is, if the transactions cost in this world was 0, it wouldn't matter because anything we wanted to do, we could do instantly. But of course, time is a cost, right? You pay interest for it. Uncertainty is a cost. Disagreements are a cost. So he says what you do is you can't figure out as an economist or a lawyer how it is that a partnership ought to organize and what things it ought to make. So A lawyer comes together and says, the law of contract says Mr. Yang is supposed to be in the automotive business. Mr. Epstein is supposed to be selling toothbrushes. Not going to work. So what we have to do is to create very simple forms in which the two of us can get together. And the cheaper it is to form the contract, the more likely it is that we'll be able to realize those gains. If you remember at the beginning of this thing, I said mutual transactions, right? Mutual transaction between two parties for gains. So now let's put some numbers to it. If it turns out the potential gains are 20 and the cost of transaction at 25, nobody's going to do it. You lose 5. If you can get the transaction cost down to 5, all of a sudden there's a 15-unit gain. So there are 2 ways to think about this. One is Kos and one is Keynes. Keynes was always a big guy looking for aggregate measures of investment and savings and so forth. Who knows how those things work? Ronald's solution was very simple. You lower the transactions cost, more and more gainful transactions will take place. Some people will invest, some people will save, some people will spend, some people will do this. He said, let them figure it out. Don't try to figure out what the collective values are on everything. So the Kosian theorem for social welfare is you minimize transactions costs, you maximize welfare. And the basic argument is it's easier to observe that transactions costs are going up and down than it is to observe, right? And whether or not you've got the right multiplier in some very abstract model trying to figure out what aggregate social investment ought to be. And so then you start looking at the law and you realize, hey, that's exactly what we've been doing for all these years from the time I was a Roman law student, right? Well, Roman law illustrations of it. You and I want to make a contract for a loan. How do we know when the deal is being dickered and how do we know when it's concluded? Answer is we have a formality. It was called in Roman law contracta stipulatia. I would ask you, do you, Ethan, promise to pay me 10,000 sesterces, i.e. dollars? And you say, I, Ethan, say, I do. Well, I mean, you can't get those words out randomly, right? And so what happens is that marks the change. But today we have statutes of frauds, we have recordation system, we have rules on admitting parole evidence and lots of other stuff, all of which are designed not to be telling you what to do, but to tell you how you sort these things afterwards. And so I see a lot of real estate brokers, and sometimes I just get a little, shall we say, playful. And I try to give them nightmares. I say, I have a great idea. Let's abolish the statute of frauds so that oral contracts are enforceable. After all, why would we want to stop them from being enforced? And they look at you. How do we know when this oral contract's taking place? How do we know what its particular terms are? We need a clean, simple rule to tell us what we should or should not do under all these circumstances. And that's what we're after. And then it turns out the statute of frauds has a very simple proposition is oral agreements that are fully executory, neither person has done anything, are not enforceable. But then suppose somebody does something. Now, remember I said at the back of every simple rule, there was always a complex tail end? Well, the law that deals with passing possession, paying part payment, making improvements, it's really complicated stuff. But the truth about the matter is most people are sensible enough that they don't let a potential buyer go into the premises and wreck the place before you got a written agreement. And so the exceptions are there to handle idiosyncratic cases, but they don't upset the basic way in which the system starts to work. And so Kos has always been much more influential amongst lawyers than Keynes, because he's the one who tells us what we're supposed to do. And it's funny, Ronald and I were good friends, and he really did not fully understand the greatness of his own achievement. So this took place 35 years ago. I was in a room I think it was at the Liberty Fund, and we were talking about various things, what Ronald did, what Jim Buchanan did, what I did, relatively little. People always misunderstood. They always thought that when I wrote The Problem of Social Cost, I was trying to figure out how to adjudicate boundary disputes and nuisance cases. And I looked at Ronald and I said, the world was right and you were wrong. It turned out the methodology that you use, covenants and agreements and licenses and so forth, to deal with the nuisance cases can be used in corporate transactions, in lease transactions, in condominium associations, in anything you want. Just keep the eye on the central ball, and it's right. And it is interesting. I mean, to the day he died, and Ronald lived to 102 and a half, he always groused that people had misunderstood him. The last time I had lunch with him, I think it was about 101 and a half years old. And he says, Richard, my life has been a failure. I said to him, Ronald, anybody whose name becomes an adjective is a success. So if we ever have a Yangian universe, right, you'll know you've made it big, Ethan. It turns out we have a Kosian universe. Why is that? Because like Keynes, he really stood for a proposition that had universality. And in fact, in our business there. Now, if you're a government agent trying to minimize or trying to figure out how you organize currency transactions, are you going to be able to do the same Kosian framework? And there's a big battle about this. And my answer is, yeah. If you can basically say, well, keep the monetary supply relatively stable, what you're doing is you're reducing transactions costs for everybody else by making sure that when you have a sale of goods in exchange for cash, the size of the rule of the cash doesn't change day to day. And so stability in currency facilitates transaction. So it turns out that this is also, in some sense, a kind of a Kosian insight. And what's so extraordinary about Ronald is every time you scratch the surface of a problem that looks to be really very unique, what do we do with adoptions and children and things like that? Underneath it, there's a lot of the stuff that Ronald is talking about. We figure out how to grease the wheels. You figure out what it is that you want to do. And that in many ways is the simplest rule that allows us to organize a very complicated world.
And so we're nearing the time limit for our podcast. So I'd like to ask one more question. This was obviously a ton of information for our listeners. So
that's good.
The big takeaway for maybe those government administrators that are listening in, why should we have simple rules and why would that allow us to live freer and more prosperous lives?
What happens is if you get simple rules, you do two things. One is you allow people to plan more than they could do if the rules were complicated. So if every time you had to get a permit before you could do something, it slows things up. It makes people reluctant to invest and so forth. And so therefore, having rules that look at these externalities and don't worry about these internalities is great. So you don't want the government to tell you how wide your hall has to be in order to accommodate wheelchairs. What you want the government to do is say, put the halls on any side you want, and then real estate guys or wheelchair makers will make them narrow enough to fit the hall. And so you don't need the whole ADA apparatus. And if you do want somebody to give you a special facility, don't regulate everybody. Just simply pay somebody to do the kind of thing that you want. And usually a private foundation could do that better than a government agency. And the second thing that simple rules do is that they limit government discretion. One of the things that you know is that there are two kinds of exchanges when you put things into collective solution. Number one is what you would call the perfect ideal. And that is everybody puts in X and everybody gets in the same rate of return, 0.2 on X, when the transaction goes forward. And so if it turns out that you can get that arrangement, nobody's going to object in taxes if they're going to make themselves richer, particularly if they're told that if you can opt out and everybody else is in, then everybody's going to opt out and you're all going to lose the game. And so essentially pro rata gains under a non-discrimination rule becomes the key for justifying government sorts of action. On the other hand, suppose, and so if you're doing a corporation, the reason you have shares, right, is because it's easy to monitor what the gain is. Everybody gets the same return on the shares in this public corporation that we're talking about. But now suppose we have another corporation. And what this corporation says, we want you to put in X dollars, every one of you. And then we'll figure out who gets what from the corporation. And so you now all put in 10 and one guy gets 18 and another guy gets 3. You don't even know which one you want. Do you want that uncertainty? The answer is no. And if you do know what it's going to be, then one guy's going to fight like hell to stay out, and the other guy's going to try to coerce him to get in. And so this pro rata rule essentially prevents all that kind of intrigue from taking place. Then there's the issue, suppose you do people pro rata, and there's a lot of uncertainty. If you have simple rules, the uncertainty is lower, so the investment commitment is going to be larger. If you have complex rules, even if they're fair to everybody, it's going to make everything more difficult. So trying to get this basic structure right will do it. And let me just give you a last example. Take a sport like baseball. And we puts, right? And so the ball comes over the plate and it's outside by an inch or two. Say, well, the pitcher really tried very hard and the wind was up. We'll call it a strike. And then the same thing, the ball was just foul. Well, it was bad luck. It should be really treated as fair. We don't do that, right? We just simply say, okay, we don't care about the elements and so forth. We're going to basically see what the outputs are, and that's the way we're going to do the game. Is that the only thing we do now? And suppose it turns out you get somebody throwing beanballs or giving head tackles. We then have a criminal law system, mens rea, in those narrow cases where this Output rule doesn't work, but we're not interested in negligence. We're interested in real malefaction. And that's exactly the way the sports rules are organized. And that's the way in which you kind of want to organize your society. So the Biden administration, they're filled with intuitive tinkerers, one after another. And what always happens is the people who tinker always think they're smarter than everybody else. And they're not. First of all, they make lots of mistakes. They got lots of dubious motives. But the moment I understand that I got a tinker in government, all of a sudden I'm going to change the way I behave. That will neutralize the kind of rules that he could put into effect. So you don't want to get into this game of dubious move, dubious response. If you could keep the game simple, it's fine. Or as Red Auerbach used to say in basketball, why is it a great game? He said, because the floor is fat and the ball is round. So what you concentrate on is making good passes rather than trying to figure out how that ball is going to bounce. Right? And that's essentially what the world is about.
Richard, thank you so much for that very insightful and illuminating interview. For our listeners, his book is Simple Rules for a Complex World. It's a relatively recent book, but a timeless message. And
it's 26 years old.
I said relatively, you know.
Well, compared to The Wealth of Nations, yes. But as an academic book, it's kind of old. But the message is strong enough and the title is clear enough that the book continues to have some influence.
Yes, thank you for that. And of course, this is, like you said, this is a book that certainly in today's world, with the regulatory state growing bigger and bigger, is something we should certainly revisit. And so to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and please keep a lookout for our next guest. Thank you.